So there we go. Um, Welcome to our very special Redbreast Christmas tasting. Could we call it Christmas tasting? I'm very impressed that we have people who have managed to
Yeah,
hold on to their samples if they were bought over Christmas and not drink them during those dark nights through December. And it's great to have a nice wee tasting in January when traditionally things get very quiet and there's not many events on. So thanks for joining us. Before I introduce Andrew Dickey from Irish Distillers, I have a little bit of uh, marketing to do. We do have two more tastings coming up in January, and they're both Burns Night tastings. So one in Dublin and one in Killarney. The one in Killarney is actually on Burns Night, which is the 25th, and that includes traditional Burns style supper and four whiskey samples. Tickets for that, if anyone's near Killarney, they're available on the dramsdelivered.com website under tasting events. And it's a very reasonable price night for €35. You get a three-course dinner and four whiskies. And that's pretty amazing value for money. Anyone who's been to the Celtic Whiskey bar in Killarney will know the food's very good. So that should be a great night. Also in Dublin the day before, because unfortunately I'm double booked, I'm going to be doing two tastings that week. So on the 24th, which is the Wednesday, we have the great people in the Flowing Tide on Abbey Street hosting us for our own Burns night tasting, and that will include six amazing Scottish whiskies. So I just admit some more people. Um, yeah, so in the Flowing Tide on the 24th, six amazing Scottish whiskies, and they can be bought from CelticWhiskeyShop.com, and it's €30 for that tasting. So unfortunately, no Irish whiskey, but it is a Burns night tasting. So whiskies that we think Robert Burns might have liked himself, and he was the original whiskey brand ambassador, I think, He did a lot for Scottish whiskey, so it's good to try some great whiskies on Burns Night. That's enough of my waffling. I'm very happy to introduce Andrew Dickey to you all, and Andrew is a brand ambassador for Irish Distillers, and he's going to take you through the tasting tonight. We just agreed a tasting order, so we're going to go, correct me if I'm wrong, Andrew, Lustau, then
mhm.
Tawny, then 12-year-old cask strength, and of course, finishing up with this 27-year-old, which is also cask strength. Um, so that's it. Like I said, please do use the chat function to chip in at any point. And anyone who's not in Ireland as well, let us know where you are. It'd be interesting to find out where everyone is in the world. So thanks, Andrew. You can take it off if you want.
Thank you very much, Al.
Yeah.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you all for joining me. Just making sure my speaker is working okay
Yeah.
and my
Yep. Yeah.
microphone.
Yeah.
Yep, perfect. Thank you all for joining us. My name's Andrew Dickey, and I'm the brand engagement and advocacy team manager for Irish Distillers. So I've been with Irish Distillers about 5.5 years now. I started predominantly working on all things white spirits in our category, so all our vodkas, rums, gins, tequilas. And as of August, I've taken over as a prestige Irish whiskey ambassador as well. So for those of you that may be new to whiskey or new to the whiskey category, predominantly Irish whiskey. Irish Distillers are makers and owners of some of the world's most renowned Irish whiskies. That being this evening, we're going to touch on everything Redbreast. We also work with brands that produce brands like the Methanamanus, which is a new innovation style Irish whiskey. Middleton, of course, Middleton, very rare, one of Ireland's most sought after Irish whiskies, as well as the spot ranges, Jameson, obviously, owners and makers of Jameson and Powers and Napo Castle as well. So we have quite a large portfolio, which I would look after. But today we're going to touch on all things Redbreast. And as Alice already touched on, we're going to go with Lustau to begin with, then one of the latest edition releases, which is Tawny Port. Then our cask strength 12-year and finish with 27. So I know Al says maybe at the end we do a virtual hands up at whose favourite is who, but we think we may know who everyone's favourite might be towards the end of the night as we finish on. But I suppose a little bit of depth and a dive into, I suppose, the Redbreast brand. I won't talk, I'll maybe start with a little bit of history, then go into tasting, because we want to crack in of these whiskies straight away. And we're actually, Lustau was launched in 2016. So again, probably a relatively recent permanent addition to the Redbreast family. So I suppose to start with all things Redbreast, we have to go back as far as 1857 with the W.N. Gilbey Group, which actually set up on the corner of Berwick Street and Oxford Street. And they were, I suppose, importers of fine wines and spirits. They benefited greatly due to a number of factors. There was a taxation deficit from the French. So I think there was from 12% down to 2% for wines. So they would import a lot of wines and distribute them out. What also helped the Gilbey family was in 1860 was the introduction to the off-license system. So they could start selling to the general public, which greatly benefited sales. And then a number of years later, they decided to set up shop in Ireland itself, in Dublin. They actually set up in 1866 is where 1861 is where they first moved, and in 1866 they set up quite a large facility and shop on Upper Sackville Street, which is now known today as O'Connell Street. And we have to remember, a lot of people, I've come from, I suppose, quite a cocktail background. I worked in quite a few big cocktail bars, one being, as I'm sure you can tell from the accent, I'm from up north, so just outside of Belfast. And I would have started one of the cocktail bars I worked in was the Merchant Hotel, which is a world-renowned famous cocktail bar. And there was always sherries, and we always loved sherry. And there's always a saying in the bar that sherry makes any cocktail taste automatically better. And no matter how poor you made a cocktail, a drop of sherry goes well. And we have to remember that back in the 1860s, and even as far back as I think it's the mid 1700s, Ireland was the biggest drinkers of sherry per capita in the world. And I always try and go back to get these nostalgic feelings. I remember going through my grandparents, God love them, no longer with us, but I remember going through their cupboards, and there's always a bottle of a cream sherry or a Fino or an Oloroso. So there was always sherry about somewhere in my grandparents' house. And that's predominantly what we kind of say is about Redbreast. Redbreast is a sherry-driven single pot still Irish whiskey. I suppose to stop there, maybe go into the category itself of Irish whiskey. We need to understand that there are four main styles of Irish whiskey, and what we're focusing on. Hopefully, there are big Redbreast advocates out there that already know it's a single pot still, but maybe for those that don't know about the categories of Irish whiskey, I suppose what we have to remember is when we're talking about 1866 and Redbreast and Gilbey's within Upper Sackville Street. If we look at dates of Irish whiskey, we usually talk 1780 with John Jameson and Son setting up on Bow Street. We talk about 1791 and John Powers opening up the John's Lane distillery, now where the NCAD is. But, we have to understand that at these times and these eras that single pot still whiskey was the best selling whiskey in the world. Nowadays, when we talk about, I suppose, new consumers into whiskey, we automatically know that Jameson is a blend or Powers Gold Label is a blend. They didn't come to it a lot of years later on, as far as probably around 1968 is when things started to transition into blending. Everything pre that was all single pot still whiskey. So when we talk about classifications of Irish whiskey, we have blends, we have single pot still, and single pot still is a mash bill of malted and unmalted barley. And it actually came about, the whole pot still area came about because it was, I think, 1685 under the British monarch rule, they decided to impose tax on the Irish distillers on malted barley. Now, the Irish hated two things more than anything, one of them being taxes. And what they decided to do was actually to evade that taxation, they started mixing their mash bills with unmalted barley, a large proportion of unmalted barley, and maybe a little bit of malted barley that they had to pay tax on. As a result of that, pot still was created. And then different areas of Ireland at the time would have made it. I don't want to jump too far ahead into history, but with the amalgamation of Irish distillers in 1966, there was a friction between Powers and Jameson and even Cork Distilling Company by the Murphy family, because Cork pot still whiskey was different to Dublin pot still whiskey. So there's kind of this head to head in terms of, ours is better, but let's look at your techniques, so on and so forth. So we'll stop there just in terms of where we're going with history and Redbreast specifically. We do have to remember around in the 1974, they were producing upwards of 300,000 gallons. Now, what they actually would have done, they were bonders. So although we know today, Jameson, Powers, and Redbreast all come from our distillery now in Middleton, County Cork, where I was first thing this morning. If anyone wants to follow me on Instagram, I was telling Al before we started that I was chatting to our master distiller, Kevin O'Gorman, down there this morning beside a stack of casks, part of our shopping area. On the outdoor area, and a little Robin Redbreast decided to float on top. So I took a lovely picture of it, and it's up on social media, Andrew_Irish Distillers. You can actually see I was there first thing this morning, and now I'm in Costa del Belfast. But there's we have to remember that these bonders what they would have done is purchased their distillate or the new make spirit, this new make pot still, from the likes of John Jameson and all their distilleries in Dublin at the time. And they would have once they would have sold their imported wines, whether it's Bordeaux wines or sherries. There we go. Yeah, it's a little red, and I swear it's not photoshopped. It generally is.
It's not going to show up on the laptop, unfortunately, but yeah, because my camera is rubbish, but it's there.
Yeah, it was there. And one of the bartenders beside me said it's the most well-fed Redbreast in the world because they feed it every morning. It's always floating about beside the distiller's cottage. So yeah, look, we'll pause it there and we'll get stuck into the first one, which is Redbreast Lustau. So if we want to have a nose at this one, we'll talk a little bit about it. So Redbreast Lustau, it's funny, the first and second are quite a close connection to each other. So Redbreast Lustau was launched in 2016. Single pot still Irish whiskey that is non-age statement. So when you look at the bottle, there's actually no age statement on it. However, what you will find, it has changed over the years. Originally, what we would have said is it's anywhere between a 7 to 11-year-old single pot still, but actually over the past few years, it's kind of changed. Well, sorry, over the past few batches, it's changed between a roughly 9 and 11-year-old, and it was launched in 2016 as part of our Iberian series. Do you want to have a nose? This one. For me personally, and I don't know about the rest of you, but I actually find this one probably the sweetest on the nose and the palate. But it's bursting full of like this sweetness. It's almost like almond, like a marzipan kind of confectionery like sweetness. But underneath that, it's like almost like stewed apricots is what I find. And that's like a synonymous. We touched on Redbreast 12, but when everyone talks about Redbreast 12, we always talk about Christmas, like this Christmas cake aroma. It's like these sultanas, raisins, cinnamon, nutmeg. For me, I actually find this a little bit lighter. If you want to have a
kind of
taste,
citrusy for me, Andrew.
There's almost like an orange peel citrus to it as well.
That's a definite orange peel thing. Yeah. I'm just getting over a cold, and I think I timed it just right for tonight. Finally got my taste buds and my nose working again.
I've yet to come down with anything. Everyone in the house has had it except me, so touch wood. It won't come in January. January's a busy month. I've seen Jer Haley said like peppery licorice there. Yeah, I get that as well. It's funny, licorice actually. You actually see it in quite a lot of gins. Sorry, I come from that background as well, but quite a lot of gins would put licorice in their distillation, and actually it's due to add sweetness, especially the likes of London dry gins. You'd see would have quite a lot of licorice root in their distillations. But it's funny when you pick up that licorice, it reminds you of sweetness. If you want to have a taste,
cheers, everyone.
There's this beautiful dryness to begin with, but as it opens up and it elevates, there's almost like this creamy, like an oily, viscousy type of aroma. Goes well with the Christmas cake. Yeah, that's where I'm really getting that almond sweetness from, and almost like it's hard. Like we used to in the bars, we make a lot of like Christmas style syrups, and we actually use like fresh clementine juice, and that's kind of where I'm getting that like Christmassy syrup kind of. But then this real dry nuttiness at the end. So I guess just to talk, as we're diving into the whiskies themselves, when we talk about Redbreast, we usually talk about the inclusion of sherry, but Redbreast, all the Redbreast range are a combination of single pot still Irish whiskey, aged in bourbon casks and then ex-European oak casks that would have housed Oloroso sherry. With this expression, so Redbreast Lustau, which was launched in 2016, was part of the Iberian series, and it was basically a homage between the I suppose the cooperages and the bodegas that we work with in Jerez, which we purchased a lot of seasoned casks from. It was those relationships built up over time with now our master distiller emeritus, Billy Lighton, who's hung up the boots, so to say, and Dave McCabe, our blender, has now been promoted to master blender. But Billy would have made good connections with these guys and girls, especially in our Antonio Paez Labato cooperage, which is where we would take all our casks from. But when they were in that region, they came across a bodegas called Bodegas Lustau, and Bodegas Lustau are seen in Jerez as one of the top producers of sherries. So how we actually go about it is we use ex-bourbon cask for part of the single pot still. Then we put more single pot still in ex sherry cask. Well, sherry, Oloroso sherry seasoned European butts. But then on top of that, we would finish this whiskey from anywhere from, it was predominantly 12 to 18. Now it's actually stretched to anywhere from 18 to 24 months is where we would finish this whiskey in freshly seasoned Oloroso sherry butts that have been seasoned with Bodegas Lustau sherries. So, and when we talk about whiskey, we always talk about, things going up and down. Sorry, I'm just seeing messages pop up there as we're talking. So I'm trying to read them as well. But what we have to remember, part of the, I suppose, the biggest thing about Irish whiskies, and even though this is a non-age statement, we've talked about, it used to be predominantly 7 to 11-year-old. Now it's closer to 9 to 11-year-old in the composition makeup of Redbreast Lustau. The biggest part of a blender is forecasting of what's coming up and what's, what's going to happen in 10, 20, 30, 40 years time. If we take even like a Redbreast 12-year-old, for example, then 12-year-old in Irish, anything in Irish whiskey bottle, the age on the bottle is the youngest form in that bottle, whether it be a single malt or a pot still. But what we actually have to remember is, even though it says Redbreast 12 on a Redbreast 12 bottle, realistically, it's probably 16 years. We have to look in advance of 16 years because it takes predominantly 4 years to get a cask. And we have to remember that, when we take casks, they have to be, the trees have to be felled. Once they're felled, they go to the Matabar sawmills in Galicia, which are cut down into staves. Then those staves are air dried for a minimum of 18 months. We have to get their moisture content down to a certain percentage before they're the right, I suppose, the right moisture level to form into casks. Once we've created the cask, then it's sent to Antonio Paez Labato cooperage, which is then they season the casks with their sherry, and then that's seasoned for a minimum of 2 years. So it's part of the I suppose the rule of the blender is to forecast what's up ahead. Yes, Al.
To put that in perspective, when I started working in whiskey in 2003, there were 2 single pot still whiskies available, and it was Redbreast 12 and Green Spot.
Green Spot.
And so we're tasting whiskies that are in, they've been matured during that sort of period, with the exception of the last one. So Irish distillers have had to basically look at the whiskey trade in the early 2000s when there were 2 single pot still whiskies and predict that pot still whiskey was going to take off, and especially sort of high-end sherry cask matured pot still whiskey or matured in other high-quality casks. So fair play, because they could have been left behind. You guys could have just let things carry on the way they were and not have enough stock to bottle all these amazing Redbreast sort of expressions.
I know. And it's to do with those that came before us as well. They had the vision to lay down, especially when Irish whiskey was on its knees, and we'll probably touch on that as we go through the history of Gilbey's and then into, of course, Irish distillers acquiring the brand. But it was that's the unique Irish style that we're playing on. Yeah, exactly, Sebastian. But I suppose I shouldn't touch on it too much. But in 1875, at one stage, Gilbey's were selling upwards of 83,000 cases of whiskey globally. That was compared to about, I think it was 38,000 was the total Scotch volume. Al, wow. Is there a little tone in the accent there I hear?
Yeah, but You know, the Irish took their eye off the ball for a while. They're kind of back on it again, you know.
Um, but please put into the put into the group chats what your opinions are on Lustau. As I said, this is what we're tasting quite a few newish ones. I suppose Lustau, I remember it coming out when I was still working in the bar trade, and then shortly after that was Mallow Love, which
Oh
took
yeah,
over
yeah, yeah.
everyone's heart. I remember seeing it in the Friend at Hand up, or actually not the Friend at Hand up. No, it would have been the Friend at Hand up in Belfast. It opened in 2016, I think. But I remember seeing it in there. I remember seeing it in the Merchant Backboard, and that was like, well, that's a special bottle. That's Redbreast Lustau.
I'll just read out some of the notes just so that people can,
Yep.
who are watching back on the video, they won't get to see the notes. So, some people mentioning chocolate, rum, and raisins, delicious.
Mm.
Mint, chocolate, bitter, sorry, mint, orange, bitter chocolate on the palate.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the great tasting notes. And there's certainly for me, there's a lot more layers to this one than I remember trying it the first time. It could be
Yeah.
that just a little step up in age profile has added a bit more complexity to it.
Yeah, and it's great. Some of the great feedback there from what the tasting notes. For me, yeah, I definitely get the chocolate. It's more like a milk chocolate, which bourbon distilleries do source casks from. We don't really talk about the bourbon distilleries. It's depending on what's available within where predominantly. They all are bourbon casks. We don't really talk about where we get them from, but there are certain grades, and we have to remember as well within the bourbon category itself, there's quite a lot of different charring levels as well. So you can go from level 1 right up to level 5, which is level 5 is what they technically call an alligator char. So different distilleries. We actually predominantly work with. We don't actually work with, I suppose, distilleries. So as such, we work with the Calvin Cooperage, and they produce the casks for us. And then once they're seasoned, they're brought back straight to the Calvin Cooperage, and then they would come direct to Middleton. But it's a good point. And then we're always talking about S&R programs and sustainability roadmaps nowadays. When we talk about casks in Middleton, we use casks maximum of 3 times. We call that B1 for first fill, B2 for second fill, B3 for third fill. And both are Oloroso seasoned European sherry butts and our ex-bourbon casks from Kentucky. We have to remember ex-bourbon casks are about 200 litres. They are 200 litres, and sherry butts are 500. So we actually have a lot more stock of bourbon casks than we would have sherry casks, just because sherry has 2.5 times the capacity of what a bourbon cask would hold. But then, of course, through the innovation in the years, we've had the inclusion of different casks, and we will touch on that this evening with our final tasting. But the connections, and I suppose the relationships that have been built up over time with the likes of the Calvin Cooperage and the Antonio Paez Cooperage, pays dividends, and we'll talk about that as we go into the next one. I suppose just in terms of the name Redbreast, so it was W.A. and Gilbey's were producing it. By around 1887, they had formed an amalgamation with Jameson, and you actually started to see on the bottles they were producing of Irish whiskey that it said JJ&S, which is John Jameson and Sons. So they would have taken their horse and carts with these emptied wine casks, taken them to Bow Street, filled them up with single pot still from Jameson, and then aged them for a certain amount of time. And actually would have said JJ&S, and 6 years was the youngest. The brand would have been the Castle Grand whiskies, and there was quite a few different iterations. There was like 3 or 4 different iterations, and they all were like 33% underproof and so on and so forth. But the actual term Redbreast wasn't seen until 1912. I believe it was August 1912, and it was due to one of the managing directors at the time, one of the family members, was a big bird watcher and a bird fancier, and they actually had a big meeting to decide what they wanted to release a new expression of, and apparently there was 3 different birds. So it was redbreast, thatch finch, and I can never for the life of me remember the third one. Thank God they stuck with redbreast, because I wouldn't like to have to start doing tastings with thatch finch. It might be a tongue twister after the 4th or 5th whiskey. We're talking 1912 is where we see the name Redbreast come to fruition, and then lots of stuff happened in the Irish whiskey history. Things went down south pretty quickly in terms of all Irish whiskey because we have 1919, we have Prohibition, 1916. The rebellious were taking over John Jameson and Sons, to warn off English mercenaries. There was lots of things happening. We have to remember at that time Irish whiskey's biggest export market was the US, and even to this day it's probably still the US. But what actually occurred was, due to Prohibition, bootleggers and moonshiners were taking empty Irish whiskey bottles and filling it up with bootleg spirit, and this really had a knock-on effect of those. Once Prohibition lifted, and Americans were tasting Irish whiskey and they had a bad experience, so Irish whiskey got a bad rap. If we go back even further, 1830, an S Coffey created a column still, or the coffee still, and well, he didn't create it. He suppose he revolutionized something that he seen was missing. So he actually was a tax collector, a tax bailiff, and he would have went round the likes of John Powers, George Rowe Distillery. He would have went to John Jameson, to make sure everything was being recorded correctly and that all taxes were imposed properly. And he's saying that there was an issue with, well, they weren't getting the best out of the stills that they were using at the time. So he decided to patent this coffee still, and it's a continuous column still. And what this does, it's able to get to a higher alcohol by strength, by volume, which what we use to this day to make grain whiskey. So it was a discovery of making grain whiskey. And the Irish have a term for it called the silent spirit, which they didn't really like. It wasn't single pot still Irish whiskey. It didn't have this oily, textured, I suppose, full mouthfeel to it. When we talk about grain whiskey today, we usually talk about light and floral and quite green, grassy notes. And then, there's lots happens once we introduce cask aging within that. Lots of different things happened along that. And then once Prohibition had lifted, Scotch started to take over, and it was the blended Scotch, or Scotch brothers and sisters decided to use this column still from an S Coffey, and that's where they mixed their single malts with grains, and blended Scotch really started to take over. And Irish whiskey had a huge downturn for a number of years. I think if we go back, it was 70. I think the date was 1779. There was 1,228 distilleries in all of Ireland, and by 1830 there was 32. Then we go back on, then things rose again. This is known as the golden era of Irish whiskey. And then when Prohibition started, and then we had an economic tax war, we had wars with the English government. They stopped all exports of Irish whiskey to anyone in the British colonies. So we lost the likes of New Zealand, which was a huge market for us, Australia, and Irish whiskey started to decline on a rapid scale. 1966, the three families came together, which was John Jameson and Son on Bow Streets, John Powers and Son with the O'Reilly family, headed up by Frank O'Reilly, and then we had the Murphy family, which were Cork Distilling Company, and Cork Distillers opened up in 1825, 75, 25, I always forget. 25, 75, I'm lying, 1875. And the three families came together in one of the family estates to basically try and resurrect or try and salvage what was going on across the Irish whiskey category. As a result of this, there was lengthy discussions over approximately 2 to 3 weeks, and thankfully they decided to all come together. We have to remember, Redbreast went from strength to strength to strength, but many things occurred along the way, especially, we touched on like 1919's Prohibition. Around 1925, Redbreast, with, I suppose, recession, economic turmoil, only the rich and wealthy could drink Redbreast, and it was actually known in 1925 as the priest bottle, because it was, the clergy liked to touch a splash of Redbreast during their days. So that's, we'll stop there before the amalgamation of IDL, 1966. We'll jump on to our newest release within the Redbreast portfolio, which is Redbreast Tawny Port. This will be the second one. Hopefully you all know which samples is which. This one is actually launched. This is a continuation of Lustau, so it's nice to jump from Lustau to Tawny Port. much remember. Sorry, I didn't touch on it before. Redbreast Lustau, 46%, and Redbreast Tawny Port, be 46% ABV as well. So this came about again with those connections that Billy Lighton had made with a lot of the different cooperages that he would purchase casks and a lot of the houses, the bodegas that would have seasoned casks. And this is the second limited edition release within the Iberian series. So Lustau is our permanent release within the Iberian series in 2016. In 2021, we launched Redbreast PX, which was a limited release, and it was a very, very big seller. It's very hard to get your hands on a bottle nowadays. And then in start of September 2023, we launched Redbreast Tawny Port. So again, this is a non-age statement, but it's actually very similar to Lustau. It's about 9 to 11-year-old whiskey within this composition. So you want to have a nose of it?
It's really quite different, isn't it?
It's, I'm getting a lot more like a red fruit character.
Yeah.
And for me, it's almost like a cherry kind of nose to
it. Do join in, everyone on the chat. Let us know what you think of the aromas and the taste. Obviously, we'll be tasting it very quickly.
Before we go on to the taste there, I suppose the makeup of Redbreast Tawny Port, again, non-age statement, 9 to 11-year-old single pot still whiskey. It's very much the same. All Redbreast, you know, we always try and follow the DNA of Redbreast, which is this bourbon component. The bourbon's going to add that caramel, that butterscotch, that vanilla, that sweetness. You want to get the Oloroso sherry, which will add, you know, we're talking those Christmas cake aromas, those nuttiness, that like apricot, raisin, sultana, even like a milk chocolate almost. But on top of that, we add the addition of Tawny Port casks, and it is a bit of a confusing composition. So we'll actually marry our, when we're making the composition, we take the ex-bourbon and the ex-Oloroso sherry, single pot stills, we'll vat them together. We will take a proportion of that out and put into hogsheads that have been seasoned with Tawny Port, definitely cherry, yeah, right. So we only take a proportion of that vatting, put it into hogsheads, to season for approximately 12 to 24 months. Then we will vat that back into the original vatting, and then that entire vatting will be finished in freshly seasoned Tawny Port, freshly seasoned Tawny Port hogsheads, or port pipes, sorry. So what we actually, it's almost like a double enhancement of Tawny Port. And Tawny Port, from like out of all the ports, Ruby, which we'll touch on in a while, Ruby's kind of like that sweet stewed fruit, red fruit, whereas Tawny Port's a little bit more oxidization during the process of Tawny Port. So it has, I suppose, I would say like a higher tannin. When we talk about red wines, it has like a higher dryness on the palate, and you're getting the more of that cherry aroma. You're getting a lot, I get quite a lot of like plum, like the stone fruit plum kind of unripened plum in it.
If anyone hasn't tried a Tawny Pot, go out and buy one in January, because all the places will be selling them off cheap after Christmas. And get yourself a 10-year-old Tawny Pot, and you'll be in heaven. Drink it with some chocolate or some nice cheese.
Yeah, because I remember before Christmas, I remember speaking to one of our distillers, Eric Ryan. He says you go to Lexa Tesco and pick up like a 30-year-old port for less than €18 or something. It was great. So definitely stock up on ports. It's great, and with a little bit of whiskey and boiling water as well, almost like a variation of hot whiskey. Nearly like a chutney smell. Yep.
A bit of spiciness in there.
There is that underlying tone, and that's where I get. I suppose that not only is it, you know, we talk about ex-bourbon and ex-Oloroso sherry, we have to talk about European oak as well. And European oak adds this dryness, this almost this, I call it like an extra hint of spice. Especially on the palate. That spice as well is coming through from the single pot still. And within Middleton itself, we do make 3 styles of pot still, you know, not just the one, you know, it's not one size fits all. So within Middleton, we make what we call as a light pot, a medium pot, and a heavy pot. The heavy pot we usually call traditional pot still, or a trad pot. And within the Redbreast range, we predominantly look at a mix of light pot and mod pot, or medium style pot. It isn't until we go to the older age styles that we start introducing the likes of trad pot, which is a lot more oilier, a lot more denser. And the way we do this, we differentiate between the styles of pot still is it's all down to do with the distiller, and they have to make cuts at certain times. So the more you make a centralized cut, you're getting more of a light cut. The longer you leave the distillation, you're going to get a more medium cut. And if you try and cut towards the end of that distillation, that's where you're getting this really heavy estered trad pot, which is kind of say it's like drinking milk. It's like this massive viscosity over the palate. But not only with that, then we have the introduction of all the cask types. And then the final part of the process, the jigsaw in the puzzle, is our master blender now, Dave McCabe, and formerly master blender emeritus Billy Lighton, composing these all together. And we can see with Tawny Port, it's a great addition of almost like a double introduction of Tawny Port, between blending or mixing the Oloroso and bourbon components together, taking them out, seasoning them in Tawny Port casks, and then putting them back in and finish them for roughly 14 to 24 months is the finishing period for Tawny Port. The reason we do that is because, we constantly have to keep a check on the aging process, because a little goes a long way, especially with not only virgin casks, which we use in different expressions in our Middleton collection, but even first fills. First fills can absorb quite a lot of liquid very first, and that's what we really focus on with Redbreast. 12 cask strength Lustau and Tawny Port. We predominantly use first fill casks, and when you use a first fill cask, you're getting a lot more of that, what had previously seasoned that cask. It's drawing all that maybe residual liquid out of the wood, because it becomes quite porous. The porosity helps, and the porosity is different between bourbon cask and Oloroso sherry cask. And as a result of that, you'll get a lot more of that initial hit. And it's really important to notice, because even different brands that we work with, likes of Jameson Black Barrel, we usually with Jameson Black Barrel we try to create a really heightened caramel sweetness. And what they found, the blenders found, and the distillers found, is between 7 and 8 years of age in a first fill bourbon cask is the ideal age to extract all that sweetness, that caramel, that vanilla, that butterscotch. Once that goes over that age, that distillate won't fit into Jameson Black Barrel, so it may be used for something else. So it's the role of a blender is extremely important in creating a lot of what we enjoy and savor today. So, anyone any questions on Tawny Port?
Sebastian has a good tasting note. Tobacco leaves. I assume that's on the aromas, but it's definitely something like that. I was getting, and he's hit the nail on the head.
I don't know if it's because I've smelt so many rums over the years, but I do get almost a hint of molasses aroma to it.
But definitely in the sort of darker spectrum of aromas and the flavors.
Yeah. And even if you have separate glasses and you compare them, even from the Lustau to Tawny Port, hopefully you'll be able to understand when I smell Lustau, I find it's the sweetest. It almost has that caramel, that apricot, that almond really come to the nose, whereas you start to see it, this really red stone fruit from that oxidized Tawny Port coming through. And you do get that wine-esque type aroma to it.
Thanks, Andrew. That's the first time I tried that. So yeah, really interesting to taste the Tawny Port expression. It's very nice.
So I suppose we jump on with I suppose Redbreast did continue for many number of years, even though there was, the Irish whiskey industry was under turmoil with all the social economic factors, likes of prohibition, the trading war we had with the UK, and so on and so forth. So with 1966, when the family decided to come together, it wasn't until a few years later, around 1967 and then 1968, is when the likes of Bow Street, John Jameson and Son of Bow Street, decided to stop production, and then they moved in 1975 down to Middleton in County Cork, which was the home of Cork Distilling Company, owned by the Murphys. They just found it was at the perfect location. And we do have to remember as well, back in 1780 and 1791, when John Jameson and John Powers opened up, they had as many acres as they want to expand their distilleries and open their courtyards for the horse and carriages. And it was a lot easier to transport and work around. Dublin City built up around that throughout that time, so they were becoming unviable as distilleries as well. You know, you couldn't get things to change. There's no longer horse and carts, tankers couldn't get up the likes of the small Bow Street. I can barely get a Hyundai Tucson up there sometimes if people can't park in Bow Street. It's a difficult area to get up to. Um, so it can be quite difficult. So it just made sense to move down to Middleton, and that's where everything, I suppose, came about. But you know, Redbreast were still their own identity by WNA and Gilbey's, and they didn't really begin to fall off until around 1985. Is kind of when we last see Gilbey's ceasing productions. We have to remember that on Harcourt Street as well, they did have one of their aging facilities. It's actually on Harcourt Street that we aged a lot of their stocks underneath. And a number of years, so 1985, we kind of see the Redbreast range disappear. And it was in 1986 that Gilbey's had stopped maturing Redbreast in their vaults, and they'd entered into the agreement to sell the name to Irish distillers. Then things went quiet for a number of years, unfortunately. And in 1991 is when we launched Redbreast 12-year-old through the expertise of Billy Lighton, our Master Blender Emeritus. I'm trying to do the math here. That shouldn't be that hard. I was born in 92, it's 91, so it's 33 years ago now, is when we first see Redbreast 12-year-olds. And now, 10 years later, to mark the 10th anniversary of the Redbreast launch, is when we launched Redbreast 12 Cask Strength, and that's going to be the third whiskey we're going to touch on. So as I said, if you want to have a nose of your third whiskey. So when we talk about, I mentioned it on it earlier, we talk about Redbreast and we talk about, you know, that DNA, that Oloroso sherry, that bourbon influence, and we talk about that Christmas cake aroma. With Redbreast 12-year-old original, we have it's a 40% ABV. Now, Redbreast 12 Cask Strength changes on, I actually don't have the bottle with me because the label is all torn off. I was using it for a training session, so I do have it, but I don't have the bottle with me. The batch I had was 55.8%. I'm not too sure what batch was
let's
sent
have a
out.
look. Sorry, scrambling around to find my bottle. 58.1. Doesn't say what batch it is. I'd say there might be a few batches at that strength. You never know.
Yeah. Realistically, when we look at the likes of screens coming up here, when we look at the likes of Redbreast 12 Cask Strength, it is done on a batch by batch basis. So every batch will have a different ABV, and there may be slight nuances in the differentiation between the taste, flavor, and profile. But you know, that's the job of the master blender, to try and keep it as close as possible. And the reason for that ultimately is because, you know, we could take two light pot Middletons distillates, put them in an ex-bourbon cask, put them side by side, leave them for 12 years. They're not going to taste the same after 12 years. There are going to be slight nuances, slight differences. And it's very, very difficult to come across that. And, you know, you take that into consideration, and then you take Angel Share, which hopefully we all know about. Angel Share is basically the evaporation rate of our whiskey. And in Middleton, we lose per cask, you're talking predominantly 2% of loss per year. So, you know, after 12 years, you've lost 24% of that cask already. So you've just got slightly over 3/4 of a cask. But again, that can differentiate, and that's due to maybe a slight nuance. You know, maybe one of the bung holes wasn't put in properly. There might have been a slight leak, but, you know, we do have a master cooper on site and a cooperage team, which will check everything. And, you know, all the warehouses are monitored, even though there is a lot of warehouses. I suppose just to talk about in terms of stock supply, I believe the last count was just over 2.2 million. And we actually have, a aging warehouse in Middleton, and we also have an aging warehouse in Dungorney. And Dungorney is actually I suppose the home of Max Crockett's, or Barry Crockett's mother, Nora. So Dungorney is only about 7 kilometers up the road from Middleton, so it's not too far away. But, you know, I think to keep up with supply and demand of the growth of Irish whiskey, and look, we're in a very, very good place at that minute. I think we have to open a new aging warehouse every 2 months to keep up with supply and demand. And then I'm sure any big whiskey advocates will have seen, you know, we're doubling capacity. We're hopefully having our new still house directly across the road from where our garden still house is, up and running by 2025. So, Irish whiskey is on the up, and it's great to see that, but does face its challenges, even though we have quite a lot of stocks of
Mhm.
whiskies. But I suppose with that, batch on batch, it will change. This one I have is 55.8. And this is purely, it is Redbreast 12, just without being diluted down. So, when we look at pot stills, when we take pot stills off our third still in the distillation process, we are looking anywhere roughly around 70 to 74% ABV. We actually reduce that down to what we call casking strength. And what we found through years of trials and errors, that's roughly 64.3 is the exact ABV in which we put this into our casks. It's different for our grain whiskies, which are made on column stills. We actually keep that a little bit higher. I think it's around 68 to 70% we put it into cask at. But with pot still, it's 64.3 is how we put it into our casks. As the casks opens up and loses because of the high, I suppose the high humidity or the high moisture content within the atmosphere, through, I won't bore you too much with science, but through reverse osmosis, we will take water from the moisture in the air. That'll go through a semi-permeable membrane, which is the wood, and that'll actually start to dilute the whiskey down. So that's why we'll see, it'll go in at 64. After maybe 2 to 3 years, that's come down to maybe 62, 61. And then as it gets older and older, it'll stop drinking. Predominantly, the biggest loss is in that first year to 2 years, where you'll see the biggest drop in ABV, and then year on year it'll be slower and slower and slower. But you will have seen like some maybe single cask editions, go down as far as 63, or sorry, 50, 53, 52%. And again, it's dependent on age. But we want to have a nose of Redbreast 12 cask strength.
We already have a one note there, blast of vanilla. I'm definitely getting that
Yeah.
as well.
And that's the thing, even though we do talk about, the sherry influence in the Redbreast range, the DNA, there's a large proportion of bourbon in that. And, that I've tasted some of the single casks, some single casks, even other single casks, that have, all Oloroso sherry, and it is beautiful and it's high in tannin. But I do feel sometimes they miss a little bit of bourbon just to add a bit of sweetness and kind of round everything up. Bourbon is a huge part, and our former master distiller emeritus, Barry Crockett. The reason he created Middleton Very Rare in 1984, and even every Middleton since, it's all bourbon. Or with the Dark Wheelock range, we introduced Irish oak, and of course with one of the latest editions, White de Tonce, we introduced T5 cognac casks. But predominantly the base of Middleton Very Rare is bourbon. It's bourbon, will be bourbon. And he was a big advocate of bourbon cask, aging pot stills and grain whiskies, and it was one of his favorites. And even though we do talk about sherry is absolutely stunning, but you do need that bourbon to almost put like a structure or a backbone on it. And I think like Oloroso kind of adds like heightened levels of these red fruits, these almonds, these different styles of sweetness to it. But you definitely need a bourbon influence in there.
I'd be
You
interested to
do
hear
you do
our
can
sorry, I'd be interested to hear our tasters comments on cast types, and what do you prefer? Obviously, I think most of the people here tonight will be sort of sherry cask whiskey fans, but let us know what you think. Because there's definitely a world for both those cast types, and bourbon plays a huge part in every whiskey distillery's DNA.
yeah
By the way, I'm just adding a little bit of water because I have tried it at full strength, and I think it probably needs a little bit at least.
yeah. I'll keep mine the way it is. It's a long day on the road. I was in Middleton first thing this morning, then Waterford, and then up to Belfast via Dublin. So
Oh wow, that's a lot of mileage.
a lot of mileage.
Cheers, everyone.
Slunch everyone. For me, just compared to I know we talk about like Redbreast 12, that Christmas cake around with the cast strength, because the higher ABV, I'm getting almost like this menthol flavor, almost like a bit of mintiness
Yeah.
in it as well. Yeah. Just right at the very, very end, it's almost like a spearmint kind of taste.
Question
Please let me
from
know your thoughts, what you think.
Sebastian, an interesting one. Is there a risk with pot still whiskey to add too much spice from the cask, as the unmalted barley already delivers a lot of spice? That could be
Too
one for
much
Dave
spice in
McCabe.
terms of from the wood. Yeah, too much spice in terms of the wood.
I think it's
Well,
just spice in
that's
general.
I
And
suppose spice and I suppose that's why there's so ultimately we want to keep Redbreast. Redbreast has a DNA and a blueprint, and it is bourbon and Oloroso. And Oloroso kind of does take the center stage as we go through the range. There are slight nuances. So as I touched on earlier, Lustau, Tawny Port, Redbreast 12, and of course 12 cast strength, because the only difference between 12 original and 12 cast strength is the addition of water to bring it down to 40%. What we do is we predominantly work on first fill casks. Once you work on first fill casks, as I said, you're bringing in a lot more of those bourbon aromas and those Oloroso sherry aromas. When we start moving into the likes of 15, and it's the as much as I love Redbreast, I remember speaking to Dave McCabe about this. It was actually it was back in the start of December. I had a meeting with him up at the distillery. And he said, because we've seen some reports about the Tawny Port, and that some, certain groups didn't like it and all that stuff, and there some people weren't blown away by it. And he was like, criticism's good. He's like, because if we don't make the same, if we kept on making the same thing, but we could you rebrand Redbreast 12 and call it something else, and try and do that, but it's very difficult. But within the range, we always try and find little nuances. We have it with Lustau. We add that freshly seasoned Bodegas Lustau cask, or casks with Tawny Port. We're adding addition to Tawny Port, and the one previous to that, which was PX, we're adding a PX, which for me is like stewed raisins. PX, PX makes the world a better place, I think. PX Sherry Pedro Jimenez. I love putting it in cocktails. I love drinking it. I love mixing it. I love mixing it with whiskey cocktails. Even a little dash, like I'm talking 5 ml in an old fashioned, changes the game.
trying an Irish coffee
It's
as well.
stunning. Pedro Jimenez. Yeah, Irish coffee. We actually done a birdhouse coffee for Redbreast. It was Redbreast 12. Instead of putting like a demerara sugar or a white sugar, we put 15 mils of PX to add the sweetness. Strong coffee, lightly whipped cream, nutmeg. Beautiful. But then when we start going into the likes of 15, Redbreast 15 is where we start using more B2 and B3 casks, second and third fill casks. When we start using second and third fill casks, you're actually taking away, I suppose, those sweet and that oak driven aroma. And pot still will give spice. The first fill casks will give a certain amount of spice as well from that freshly seasoned wood. But when we start using B2s and B3s, or second and third fill casks, you're bringing a lot more of what's the term? You're bringing a lot more of the distillate to the forefront, and that's what we try to do with Redbreast 15. We're working more on the distillate. As I said, it's a combination of light and medium pot stills. And then when we go to 21 is, again, we do introduce a little bit more second and third fill casks. So you're bringing more distillate, but then we put a third style in on top of that. So you're putting trad pot. And trad pot, as I said, adds an extra dimension, adds this extra oiliness, actually adds a lot more what it touched on with the cast strength. And it must be just a higher ABV. You get that menthol, that kind of like spearmint, peppermint kind of aroma and taste on the palate. So spice can be controlled. And spices you can control as far down as new make distillates. So speaking to one of our distillers, Eric Ryan, who's a Powers distiller, and he's spent years working on the different stills. Predominantly, he makes the Powers distillate, and Powers use our light pots. And Powers is seen as a distillate forward whiskey. We focus mainly on second and third fill casks, and within that, when he goes between light pot and medium pot, light pot, as soon as that comes off the still, even at high ABV, you're still nosing it. They'll dilute it down and nose it, but you're getting like green apple, you're getting like fresh cracked black pepper. As you maybe go into your medium style pot, maybe getting a little bit more oiliness, a little bit more heavier esters. You're getting maybe a bit more, they actually say more like a red apple as opposed to like a bright green crisp apple. And green apple to me is automatically default to green spot, even though green spot is a
Yeah.
medium style pot still, and that's to do with bourbon and Oloroso sherry combination as well. So there's lots of different ways in which we can manipulate. And if you think about the amount of casks, no two casks are the same. Then if you look at like the Method Manus range and all the innovation on different casks they do, there's so many different formulations to create different expressions of whiskey. So it's like Willy Wonka's chocolate factory shop. When every time I go into the lab and see Dave McCabe and you see all the samples up, sometimes like, no, don't touch that one. I was like, oh, come on. So it's fascinating just to see it. And like when you look at it and you see some of the, I suppose, it's, as I touched on earlier, it's that forecasting. What do I need to put away now to make sure that Redbreast 27 is the same? There's stock of Redbreast 27 and 2046. So it's kind of scary to look at. But yeah, that's hopefully that answers your question on spice in terms of where we
Yeah.
can take it from. I was again, Eric talked on sometimes the blender may look at something and or may nose because our blender will say there's 20 Oloroso sherry casks at 12 to 15-year-old to make the next batch of Redbreast 12 cask strength. He'll knows every single one of them, and one might be higher in almond, the next might be higher in like what we talked about, maybe that orange peel, that clementine kind of aroma. One might be really, really nut forward. They will make sure they knows every single one, proportion them, say that's okay, then they'll vat that, and they'll kind of almost come together and marry while they're vatting separately. And as long as it's well rounded and it's at the right proportion, but there may be something as well that they notice that they don't like an aroma of or a flavor of, and that's part of the job of the blender as well. Is what do I need to up my sherry content to get rid of that aroma that I've found in that maybe a bourbon cask or so on and so forth. So it's a job. It's a job that I'm sure everyone's envious of, being able to nose them every single day.
Sorry, could
Yes,
I ask a question?
yes, go
Go
ahead.
ahead. Yeah.
I was just wondering from the blender perspective, I always find it interesting. Do they start off sometimes looking for a particular flavor profile, or is that experimentation you're talking about? Or do they say, well, I'd like to have something that's maybe, fruit forward or that sort of, vanilla flavor, and then, or is it something that they,
Yeah.
like you're saying, test and then kind of go back to the drawing board, or would they have an idea of a flavor in mind at the start?
Okay, I refer back to when I speak to Dave about it. I refer back to me. It's like the same as like bartenders when we're creating cocktails. It's like you may have a spirit that you want to use. Or you may have, oh, I smelled elderflower there, but I'm sick of smelling elderflower liqueurs. I want to make elderflower more prominent, and you bounce all the flavors off it, and that's very much the same as a blender. I know. Speaking to Dave about, I'm sure you've seen some of the Redbreast small batches for the US market they've created. And Billy and Dave sat down, and when they looked at it, they wanted the Redbreast DNA, but they wanted to emphasize something else. And how do you emphasize something else that it was being in the US market? They wanted to emphasize the bourbon content. How can you do that? Well, you get fresh American oak, virgin cask, to get that raw content through, but like minuscule amounts. Like you're talking, I think it was 10 weeks in total, just the seasoning at the very end. Once they had a composition, they maybe upped their bourbon content. So maybe you're talking 80-90% bourbon, 10% all the rest of it. I don't know formulations, don't ask. It's beyond my pay scale. But then to round that off, and you look at other brands. I know Method Madness, like they do an enhancement, which is very much that. So an enhancement would be, you've got 10 casks, say it was acacia, I'm just as an example, 10 casks that you want to introduce acacia wood to, but or even Gariana. So Gariana, which was one of our launches last year of Method Madness, to Gariana is very, very porous and will impart huge amount of flavor too much, and it's a smoke bomb. Our micro distiller Barrett Stapleton calls Gariana Method Madness what do they call it, Kansas City barbecue. So it's like almost like smoked bacon, like this apple aroma to it. It's fascinating. I actually thought it was like an Isle of Scotch to begin with. I was like, it's not method of madness. And it's a single pot still. But to enhance it, they may take, say, they need 20 bourbon casks to make up the batch that they need. 10 of those will be taken and enhanced with a cask. Then they'll be drawn out and put back and then all mixed together. So it's, you can add things in different ways and stop it and start it. And that is the role of the blender. And, every addition will be different. Like Tawny Port for me, you do get that dryness, that red wine, like that port like tannin from a Tawny Port, which is very like red wine to me. And it's just a beautiful composition. So there's loads of different ways in which we can stop, start, add, subtract, and that is the glorious role of a blender.
We've a few more questions. We might go back to them at the end and go over a few things. But then someone was asking, what would you consider heavy pot still? I assume that's just trad pot, isn't it? In Middleton sort of
so heavy pot still
terminology.
is trad.
Yeah.
It is. It's, and again, it's something that we're renowned for. And there's been a few trad pots throughout the years. We look at 1999, 2000. We look at Jameson 15-year-old. If anyone ever remembers that, or big collectors
amazing whiskey.
Jameson. Yeah. Not only that, you couldn't sell it for love nor money. But I remember speaking to my former boss. We left the business, Jer Garland, who I replaced. Jer was my manager for years. I remember him saying, Andrew, we launched it in 1999, and it was, and then we done another batch in 2000, but it was more or less the same DNA. And they couldn't sell it for love nor money. And nowadays, it's like gold dust to get Jameson 15. I actually seen one in the the makeshift distillery shop down in Middleton this morning. And it was a trad pot. And when I talk about trad pot, it basically is you're trying to get more of the tails of the distillation. You're trying to get these really like cooked. So you're trying to get a cooked single pot still. It's quite oily, really viscous. I think is it Fionn O'Connor describes it as you need a knife and fork to cut through a trad pot because it's so oily and viscous, and it's like takes over your mouth, and you can chew on it for hours. I think it's a great descriptor of what trad pot is. Light pot obviously would be our Powers DNA, and then there's a little proportion of it thrown into Redbreast, and then mod pot would be like for your spot ranges and your Redbreast. So there's lots of different variations, and then they can be used in different ways. And again, such as what Jerry Healy said there, how do you change something or add or take away, and it can be, well, maybe that needs a little bit of trad pot, or maybe that needs a little bit of bourbon MMP, which is mod pot, that's maybe 15, maybe a few years older than what the expression and what the final age statement is. So there's lots of different ways, and I guess that goes on. The Lustau began as a 7-11 year. After the last few batches, that's increased, and that's just to do with maybe the casks didn't come through with the right flavor profile, so they went for an older age and went, we've got that flavor profile now, so we'll put that slightly older to begin with pot still into it. But then I suppose we'll kick on to the fourth and final one, which is our trad pot inclusion. And this is Redbreast 27. And even if you have a look at it, the color comparison automatically is completely different. So again, this is a cask strength. I have in front of me batch number 4 from last year, which is 53.6% ABV.
Oh, yeah, we're at 53.5. So slightly different batch.
I suppose this I suppose the launch of Redbreast 27 always sticks in my head like a sore thumb, because it was about a week later that COVID-19 shut down everything.
I think I was at that launch. Was it in Bow Street?
Oh no, that was the night the government shut it down. We actually done a launch about a week before that.
Oh, okay.
And it was I remember 5 days before it. I was in the complex just off of Capel Street, opposite Brother Hubbard there. And we had or was it? Or no, we had a dinner just in the side of it. I'm getting confused with Jameson Jameson Remastered as well, the 15-year-old single pot still we launched, the limited edition one. But no, we done that, and then all up to 1661 afterwards, and then yes, they done the Bow Street launch, and I was actually in Cork because I had to have the training session that morning, and I woke up, I was in the Oyster Tavern in Cork, looked up, and there's Leo Varadkar, and then Jer ringing me, being like, "Go home, bud. You may not be down to Cork for a while." So it was, that's when Redbreast 27 launched. And what we have here, again, you can see by the bottle itself that I have beside me. This is again an amalgamation of creating those relationships, and Redbreast 27 was launched, and it was through those relationships that Billy Lighton would have spoken to the winemakers and went, "Well, we've tried Ruby Port. Why don't we try Tawny Port for Redbreast?" So it's nice to have them kind of all tasting this evening. The Redbreast 27 is a sensational drop, minimum 27-year-old. We have ex-bourbon single pot still in here. We have, which is around 27 to 29-year-old. We have Oloroso sherry cask, single pot still in here, which you're talking around 29 to 30, 31-year-old. And then we have a Ruby Port inclusion single pot still, which is, absolutely sensational. You are actually talking slightly above 31 years of age with the Ruby Port inclusion. But if you want to have a nose, and it's funny, I was talking quite a lot about menthol there. I got a menthol hit straight away.
Yeah, I'm getting that, yeah.
It might just be that might just be the cast, right? You keep going up to it.
Some good notes on the chat. Marzipan in there as well. Stoned fruits. Yeah. Baked with syrup. Multiplied by 100. Very good.
I'm also, you almost get that, like that Lyle's golden syrup kind of sweetness to it. But for me, and especially if you still have a glass of the Tawny Port, go back and forth, and you can see the nuances between Tawny and Ruby. This I'm getting a lot more bright red fruit, like more stewed strawberries and raspberry. And that's what you get with Ruby Port. You get a much bigger hit of fresh red fruits. Tawny, a lot more dried red fruit. We want to have a taste. Let's launch, everyone.
Cheers, everyone. Let us know if you're putting water in or if you're trying straight up.
If anyone can still chew it, I've swallowed that for about 10 seconds now. That's that trad pot influence. It just coats the palate. You can keep going, keep going. We actually had it with us in Whiskey Live Paris, and we had 3 bottles to do this over 3 days, and I was policing everyone bringing it out from under the counter. Like, put that away. That's what we're finishing on when we finish the convention.
Ronan says, "How could you put water in that?" And I agree. I'm glad I didn't add water. It doesn't need it.
No. You get almost like pineapple aroma to it as well. You do get a lot more of these exotic fruits as well with a little bit of the trad pot is when you start going into more like exotic fruit, right? Like mango and papaya. Yeah. And like I'm getting like a rich demerara sugar off it too.
Yeah, the palate is incredible. It is so rich and full-bodied, chewy. That it's a sensation. It's not just a taste. It's a feeling.
It feels like it takes you on a journey because it goes from like sweet to dry to, then I get like cracked black pepper around the sides, and then that viscosity of the trad pot, it kind of like sweetens everything up again.
Raspberries for Sebastian, which I get that now. Yeah, definitely. Something like raspberry chocolate, one of these fancy chocolates with bits of raspberry through it.
Bit of Lindor Lind.
Yeah.
I keep on going back to it, and now I'm like getting like a stewed plum, like a compote, like almost like a jammy, like red fruit nose to it. And that's what I love. Like as soon as you taste Redbreast 27 and say you go away and you come back a few minutes later, it's almost like it slightly changes, but then it brings you back into like the DNA of Redbreast.
It's exactly the way I haven't tried it since COVID, since that launch, and it's exactly how I remember it. Some whiskeys you forget about, quite quickly, but whiskies like this, you remember the taste for a long, long time.
Yeah,
Even if it's a few years, and yeah, uh, it's incredible.
it's. I was at the original launch of it just before COVID, and um, hadn't touched it again for about another year or two after that, and it's one that you're like, I remember that sensation, that feeling I had, because it was delivered after dinner, because they took us through, this is 12, this is 15, this is 21. Now let's introduce 27. And it's like, oh, so
It's a whole
it's
different ball
very,
game
very
when you're
special.
when you're in that sort of age profile. You're into like ultra rare when it comes to Irish
Mm,
whiskey.
yeah,
But
yeah.
the
There's
the
not,
different layers of cask character that you get at 27
mm,
years are pretty amazing.
yeah. And we're very, very fortunate, again, as we talk about, those that came before us and laid down the stocks, and the relationships that were built throughout the years between our cooperages, and having the foresight to lay these down. I'm 30. Well, I'll be 32 next month. But I was 5 when people started laying that down. It's probably, realistically, I was born and some stock was being laid down for that. That
Yeah.
what we're drinking now. So it's mesmerizing to know that it's taken that long to come to fruition, and we're very, very fortunate that we do have the stocks to release it as a permanent SKU. There's not many people that are able to put a 27-year-old permanent SKU out. Now, don't shout at me, because sometimes we run out of stock. But that's because a batch wasn't done in time. We have to be careful, and that's ultimately, that's why sometimes some brands might disappear, or some expressions within the brand. I know a lot of people talk about is it Jameson Rarest Vintage Reserve? It had a proportion of maybe port in there, and that's been discontinued, and it was to make way for 27-year-old. That's not to say it'll never come back, but it's how we have to operate, and just make sure that we have the right amount of the stocks to keep these going for many years to come.
That was an amazing whiskey, but I think the right decision was made because the Redbreast 27-year-old as a standalone single pot still is a better whiskey than the
Mm.
Jameson Vintage Reserves. And
Mm.
I think Jameson has its place, but I'm kind of putting words into your mouth, but for Irish distillers, there are levels of, whiskey, and Middleton occupies that sort of higher echelon that
Mm.
Jameson could in theory kind of occupy as well. So it's yeah,
Mm.
it's an interesting thing for the marketers, or the marketeers in
Yeah,
Irish distillers.
yeah. Well, look, that's why was part of that was looking at Jameson. We have to remember it was a single pot still, and then of course blends changed when I suppose the landscape of the Irish whiskey changed. But that's why we'd introduced the likes of Jameson. If we look, it was November 2022 when we launched Jameson single pot still, as a permanent release, which has the 5 casks, has ex-bourbon, ex-Oloroso, and the 3 virgin, European virgin oak, American virgin oak, and Irish virgin oak, in the aging process. But when we look at that, it was to pay homage to, Jameson used to be pot still, and yes, I suppose the status quo nowadays is Jameson as a blend, but then we launched the likes of Jameson Remastered as well, and that was paying homage to, we've done pot stills before, and everyone has a place, and it looks at Middleton Very Rare blend, but Middleton Barry Crockett single pot still, so it's hard to keep up at times when you're doing
Mm.
tastings. You kind of have to refresh yourself and like, what am I tasting again here? So but no, it's like 20 Redbreast 27. I wish you could afford it every day. Let's put it that way.
Oh Jesus, no, unfortunately not. We're not all millionaires. Um, there was a question earlier about the Iberian series, and I'm kind of guessing you're not allowed to talk about future releases unless it's something very imminent. But I'm guessing, like someone else here tonight, that there will be more releases within the range. Like any inkling on what could be within that sort of.
Uh, I'm not allowed to say.
Yeah. Well,
Look
I
at
mean,
look at keep up to date. Keep up to date with the Redbreast Instagram over the next number of weeks. But,
yeah, I mean, I'm kind of
But
speculating because I don't know I don't know what was out there, but I mean you have to
to,
look at
to
what
be
styles of
hot,
fortified wine there are in Iberia, in Portugal and Spain, and then you could maybe
yeah,
figure out what there
yeah.
might be. You know, could it be White Port? Could it be Montilla? Could it be Malaga? Could it be PX, another PX, or some kind of rare sherry variety? Um, there's a lot it could be, but yeah,
Well, the Malaga's kept for the Scots, but yeah, I know where you're going.
yeah,
But no, look, there's I truthfully I don't know what the next Iberian series is going to be. As I said, you can make your own presumptions, but there will be a continuation. If we go by, we had 2021 with PX, 2023, we're looking at another maybe 18 months to 2 years before there's another Iberian series, predominantly probably a limited release like PX and Tawny. But yeah, I'll leave it at that.
yeah.
they're,
Um,
yeah. I'll be
someone else
sacked in the
asked.
morning.
Someone else asked earlier as well about the transition from Gilbey's to JNS, and was there a shift in sort of spirit type at that time? I mean, I don't think anyone's really able to answer that question, but it's there, you know.
It's very hard unless you had like an original, you know. I suppose if you go Castle Grand whiskey, if you had the original 7 year, let's say JJNS, which I don't have to hand, I'm sure some people have them throughout Ireland and across the globe, but it's very very difficult to put your I suppose your finger on that. What I can say is it would have been, it was reimagined by Billy Lighton in 1991 when he came
Yeah,
to create 12 year, and he's created every single edition, and now everything coming down the line from December, well, it's probably November there, middle of November, when Dave McCabe was announced as master blender. Everything going forward will be Dave's iteration or his flavor profile, along with helping with our other blenders. And we have Deirdre O'Carroll and we have Brona Kelly. So there is a team there that they'll all come together and they'll all spread ideas. And like Kevin O'Gorman will taste, and he's part of the sensory analysis team. So there's lots of different noses, which is good to make sure that everything goes out. But I suppose just what you have to remember as well with the amalgamation in 1966, and then transitioning down to Middleton in 1975. We say we make 3 distillate types. That could have been the 3 families, and they're 3 distillate types. So that's why I like to. We don't officially talk about it, but that's what I kind of like to say is, one might have been John Jemisin's distillate, one might have been John Powers' distillate, and one might have been CDC, the Murphy family.
that's always been my thought about
That's
it as
kind of
well. Yeah,
like the way yeah, it's I actually don't know the answer, but that's the way I've always looked at it in terms of there will be different expressions. It's like when we talk about mezcal, it looks like Del Maguey, who is part of the Pernod portfolio. They have single villages, and every village will have a different expression and different style, even though it's it's mezcal. But it's different still. It's different terroir, well, different area, and it's different single village, and they have different terroir and moisture content. So everything can change the outcome, and I suppose it's an amalgamation between master cook or master blender, master distiller, all working together harmoniously to make sure that everything's top drawer. So
I would say
I was at a
to anyone who's interested in sort of Redbreast DNA, find a bar that sells the old stuff, and try it. Don't buy a bottle. Try it first.
yeah.
Because they're not perfect whiskies by any means. The modern Redbreast is a better product. But they're immensely interesting to try and taste. But the old Redbreast was a little bit sort of dirty. Is that the right way of describing it, Andrew? I don't know if you've tried any of the old ones.
I won't mention the brand for the sake of my job, but I was at a tasting from it was pre Irish Distillers formation products, and I kind of I tasted a 1950s and early 1960s, two iterations in early 1960s, obviously all single pot still. And I kind of found that as well. It reminded me, I know you shouldn't say it, but when you were younger and you went into your parents' cabinet and you maybe opened a bottle and you went, ooh, that kind of that first initial hit of like really high estered alcohol. And yeah, I found it just a little bit dusty would
Yeah.
be. But then I've tasted, I've tasted very, very old whiskies that are absolutely sensational. But it's again, it's down to preference. But I found they just weren't as well rounded or something, and maybe that was
Absolutely. Yeah.
Technological advancements have paved the way for alcohol production nowadays. And yes, even though it is it's all computerized, there's still someone there making sure that everything is being used efficiently and correctly. So that makes a huge impact. And don't get me wrong, like there's trial and error. And I'm sure there's lots of new distilleries within Ireland that will make a distillate and go, oh no, let's not go with that. And that's part of what we do in the micro distillery as well. It's expanding on that and being like, oh, that didn't work, or that cask aging didn't work, but there's ways in which we can alter it. Redbreast is so comforting. Yeah, it's
comforting.
It's like a warming sensation every time. Yeah.
Just I should maybe add about the Redbreast 12-year-old cask strength as someone who was involved in the Irish Whiskey Awards a lot in the past and still currently. It's consistently the highest scoring single pot still in that category, and obviously in recent years we've had some newcomers, but in the sort of aged pot still category, it's always Redbreast 12-year-old cask strength that does well consistently across the years. So I'm sure I'm preaching to the converted anyway, but
yeah.
If you ask anyone who's a fan of Redbreast what their go-to, with the exception of maybe the 27-year-old, what their go-to whiskey would be, it'd be the cask strength. So that's my perspective on it.
Well,
sorry, Andrew.
I was at the awards this year in Bow Street, and I was sat actually beside Dave McCabe, and he was delighted that Red Spot got a little bit of a, got the recognition it did for the category.
Yeah.
So he was delighted with that.
It's always interesting.
So
it's interesting to see the results come through. Yeah. Sorry. Chocolate made it through US customs. Congratulations. Yeah.
I brought almonds over to Miami back in 2016. They never made it through customs. That was shut down straight away.
We're getting towards the end, and normally we would do like a virtual show of hands to see what everyone's favorite whiskey was of the evening. I don't think it's really a fair one in this case. I'd be shocked if anyone didn't prefer the 27-year-olds because it is just a fantastic whiskey. So, but outside of that, what was your favorite? Let us know in the chat. I think we have 3 very strong whiskies within the Redbreast range there, and I was impressed by them all myself. I hadn't tried the Tawny port before, and it's a long time since I tried the Lustau, which I think is getting better all the time. It's a lot of the time when we have a whiskey and it's a smaller release, you find the first whiskey comes out and then the quality dips a little bit. But with this one, it's if anything, it's actually getting better over time. So yeah, we're having a few votes coming in. Owen saying Lustau, Rory Tawny port, Ronan 12-year-old cask strength.
I would always have gone for the 12-year-old, the regular Redbreast, which is delicious. But Lustau tonight was a revelation, and it's not that much of a price difference. It's a bit more, but not too much.
Yeah, yeah, it's really impressive,
and it's very different. But it's still the Redbreast brand. That's what I think. That's what I would go for. That would be my pick. Obviously, the 27-year-old, without doubt, but be realistic.
Thanks, Jer.
Um,
Adrian's gone for, well, obviously the 27 first and the 12-year-old Cask right then, the Lustau and the Tawny. Christopher's gone for the Tawny. Um, yeah, there's a good mix there.
yeah,
By the way, Owen's used his Barrel Club
that's what I was saying.
glass tonight.
They're
Sorry, go
fancy
on.
glasses. Even I don't have one of those. No, but it's just saying. I think a few of them mentioned this now, and as I said to Al before we came on this evening, and before we started, is I was when I was over in Whiskey Live Paris with Billy Lighton and Eric Wren or Powers Distiller. We were, I hadn't tasted Lustau maybe 18 months or so, and we always talk about it, and I kept on not really getting to taste it that much. And over Whiskey Live Paris for 3 days, I actually found myself going back to that towards the end of the evening. Yes, we celebrated with the 27, and those long days of they're saying, hello, you French? We're like, no, Irish. I'm trying to translate. The story of Redbreast was quite difficult. So we celebrated with the Redbreast 27, but I found myself when I was talking with guests, and like, obviously we had Tawny Port on the stand as well. I kept like steering towards the style. I just think it was one of those really the one that I kept going back to as just like an everyday kind of whiskey, which I think is a great hallmark. But everyone that's seen a comment there about value for money, like we talk value for money, like Redbreast 12-year-olds, not the cask strength. The original 40% ABV is the best selling single pot still Irish whiskey in the world, and that really speaks volumes. And I everyone says, "Is your job hard?" And I went, "No, it's rather nice job to have because the brands sell themselves, but I just get the enjoyment of tasting and talking about them, and introducing new customers and chatting with advocates of all the Middleton distillery brands. But value for money, it has to be 12-year-olds.
Yeah.
Just the standard 12-year-olds for me. If you want to go the step up, and it's an everyday drinking whiskey, then I would go with the likes of Lustau. But for a limited edition release, Redbreast Tawny Port, was it 130 in Celtic whiskey? I'm not too sure. Don't know the overall
I
prices.
wish I could say, but yeah, I'm not sure myself. Yeah.
But that's the joy of having like limited editions as well. They are special bottlings, and they are one-offs, so to speak.
Yeah.
So Lustau for me affordable. I've seen a few of them.
Well, yeah, thanks to everyone for your feedback tonight. It's been really interesting to hear your opinions on the whiskey, and I think they were all enjoyed.
Mhm.
The 27-year-old does its job itself, you can't really say much about it other than it's a great whiskey. But the real eye opener for me were the other ones, in that they all offer something different to the range, and they're all excellent whiskeys. So Andrew, thanks so much for
Al, thank you very much for having me.
taking the time out of your busy day. Uh, how long have you been on the clock? You must have had a very early start, did you?
I had the joy. I stayed in a nice hotel last night, so it's not too bad.
Oh, cool.
But yeah, I was up. It was an early start, and after I enjoy the last of these whiskies, I have to put a 5-month-old to bed, so that'll be fun.
Well,
So the joys of it.
um, we'll let Andrew go and we'll finish up. So thanks everyone for taking part tonight, and thank you very much, Andrew, again. Pour yourself another wee 27-year-old and enjoy that. Yeah, we'll put this up on YouTube, so anyone who hasn't had a chance to look at that, who maybe bought a tasting pack and they aren't around tonight, they'll get to see it. But we'll send an email out with a link to it if you want to watch it back. But thanks again, everyone, and cheers. Have a good night.